April 1943. In the concentration camp at Auschwitz, bodies were piled in heaps on the ground. Nazi soldiers clambered over the corpses, extracting gold teeth from their mouths and tearing wedding rings from women's fingers. 3 years earlier, art galleries and museums throughout Europe had been stripped bare. National banks had their holdings looted. By 1945, Germany had amassed stolen property worth billions of pounds. The gold was melted down and made into ingots. But when the war came to an end, most of the treasure had vanished. What happened to the gold, the currency, and the priceless artifacts? The answer lies in a grim odyssey that extends from the death camps to the Swiss banks, and to a group of men relentless in their pursuit of those responsible and bringing them to justice. This is the dramatic story of the hunt for Nazi gold, one of the best-kept secrets of the Second World War. The story begins with the man responsible for the Holocaust itself. Adolf Hitler's crusade to make Germany the predominant nation in the world necessitated robbery on a massive scale. He had no qualms about stealing from neighboring countries, emptying their national banks, and impounding state art collections. Hitler was fanatical about art. A failed painter himself, he intended to build the finest galleries in Europe, each stocked with stolen treasures, the very finest works purloined from French, Dutch, and Russian collections. He desperately needed money, and huge amounts of it, to create a new army, navy, and air force. The Nazis' first major act of treachery was to turn on their own people. At the heart of the fascist regime lay virulent racial hatred. Hitler demonized German Jews, blaming them for the country's defeat in the First World War, despite the fact that Jews had fought alongside Aryan Germans throughout it. Jewish businesses were boycotted, shops were daubed with anti-Semitic slogans and their owners humiliated. Nazi thugs in brown shirt uniforms were encouraged to attack Jewish people openly in the streets. Many businesses were forced to close. Influential men in the Nazi hierarchy were permitted to buy up Jewish companies for next to nothing. Wealthy Jews such as Louis de Rothschild saw their grand houses confiscated and their possessions looted. Many of them left Germany for the safety of neutral countries and deposited their money in foreign banks.
Because they thought that if they could save their money, they could somehow bargain to save themselves. They really thought that they still had a negotiable position if they had something to negotiate with. And that's why they wanted to get it out, because they assumed that that could be their only ticket to safety.
Switzerland was one of the most popular destinations for Jewish businessmen. Swiss banks were famous for their watertight security and strict rules of discretion. The emigrants expected to retrieve their fortunes after Nazi oppression ended, or so they fondly hoped. But instead, conditions in Germany under the Nazis deteriorated rapidly. During the 1930s, concentration camps were opened to accommodate all political opponents to Hitler. From 1942 onwards, some of the concentration camps became death camps for the systematic murder of Jews. It was horrific. Upon arrival at the camp, each person was stripped of everything. Many had their heads shaved, the hair to be used as stuffing for furniture. Those valuables not removed from the living were later stripped from the dead. Gold teeth were wrenched from the mouths of corpses. Some Jews were comparatively fortunate. They became slave laborers. But most met death in the gas chambers.
I can't even describe you the way they were treating us. They weren't treating us like people. They were treating us like animals. Right away, they were just looking in your mouth. And my father, before they took us in to the shower rooms, they pulled out his crowns from his mouth, and if it hurted, he couldn't, they didn't use nothing. They just had a pair of pliers, and they, like, if you tied on a horse, and this is the way they pulled it out.
The gold was melted down into bars and dispatched to SS vaults. Many of these ingots ended up in Swiss banks, where they lay hidden for years. But Hitler didn't only take fortunes from wealthy Jews. Before the war, massive loans and political contributions were coerced from non-Jewish German bankers, industrialists, and other businessmen. These men hoped to gain favors, or at least survive, under the brutal regime of the Third Reich. The price for Nazi protection was high. Those who did not pay could end up in a concentration camp. There was no legal protection against the demands of the Nazis because they had remade the laws. With German coffers bulging with stolen money, Hitler was able to embark on the next stage of his great swindle. In March 1938, German troops entered Vienna, the capital of Austria. They claimed they were uniting all German peoples under one banner and called the invasion the Anschluss. As part of this forced union, the Austrian National Bank was liquidated and its assets transferred to the German Reichsbank. In this first act of foreign theft, Hitler added some 90,000 kilograms of gold to his own treasury, a total value then of over 100 million US dollars, today worth a clear $1 billion. A year later, Hitler turned his greedy attention to Czechoslovakia. Under the guise of protecting Germans living in the Sudetenland, seized in October 1938, he annexed the rest of the country to his growing empire. But before the Germans assumed full control of the country, the Czech National Bank in Prague had the foresight to move some of its assets to the Bank of England via Switzerland. But Reichsbank officials quickly stepped in and redirected $40 million worth of Czech gold to Germany. They even tracked down the gold already transferred to Britain and forced Bank of England officials and their Swiss colleagues to hand over another $26 million worth of gold. By 1939, foreign invasion had become profitable for the Nazis. The business of channeling finances of entire countries into German and Swiss banks had got into full swing. The road to world conflict had been laid, and it was paved with stolen gold. In September 1939, dark clouds gathered over Europe. Britain and France threatened war if Germany invaded Poland. Hitler called their bluff. He bombed Warsaw and sent in his troops. Nazi high command had already profited from foreign invasion and hoped to do the same in Poland. But when the German soldiers marched into Warsaw, they found themselves thwarted. Officials of the Bank of Poland had already moved much of its gold reserve out of the country. The gold had been transported through Romania and Turkey to France, where it was deposited in the French National Bank. Hitler then turned westward. His armies stormed into the Netherlands. The Dutch surrendered in May 1940, and German officials immediately ransacked the Bank of Amsterdam. Over the next 5 years of occupation, they redirected $163 million worth of gold to the Third Reich. Belgium was next, but its national bank officials had followed Poland's example and swiftly moved the country's entire treasury into French banks. But all three nations lost control of their destinies just a month later, as France fell to the invading Germans in June 1940. Nevertheless, a large quantity of Polish and Belgian gold had already been shipped to the West African port of Dakar. An Anglo-French force tried to rescue the hoard, but Vichy French naval units controlled by Germany forced the Allies to withdraw. Another large quantity of French gold had been shipped to Martinique, a distant French colony in the West Indies. Prolonged negotiations between Vichy France under Marshal Pétain and Nazi Germany followed. Hitler wanted the gold, but he didn't wish to waste his resources by occupying the whole of Vichy France to secure it. The Führer intended to force Pétain to hand over the Polish, Belgian and French gold. Most of the Belgian reserve eventually ended up in Nazi hands. By the end of 1942, Pétain appeared willing to hand over the Polish gold. But by that time, the Allies had proved victorious in North Africa. Thus, German access to gold stored in West Africa was severed forever. The Nazi conquest of Europe had resulted in the most massive shift of money in world history. The gold reserves of entire countries were taken. This vast resource kept the German war machine driving forward. But where did all the money go? Some of it was stored by the Reichsbank in Germany, but much of it was used to acquire the more immediately useful asset, hard currency. Hitler needed ready cash, not ingots, to pay for his weapons. The best place to change looted gold into hard currency was the capital of European banking, Switzerland. That country was about to play a vital and highly controversial role in the grim story of stolen Nazi gold. Switzerland took pride in its long history of neutrality, standing apart from many European conflicts. It used this position to enhance its international reputation as a safe haven for foreign money. Its banks flourished on an image of rigorous security, discreet privacy, and honest dealing. But during the Second World War, this image masked a dreadful secret that began to cast a dark shadow over its supposed neutrality and reputation for fair trading. The Swiss claimed they stood apart from Nazi Germany in the 1940s, but in fact, they were closely involved with the Third Reich. The country's 7-man federal council, led by Marcel Pilet-Golaz, took the decision that, in order to preserve Swiss independence, it would have to do business with Hitler. In its crudest form, this meant that Switzerland would not open its borders to thousands of Jewish refugees who hoped to escape into neutral territory, and who had already deposited massive amounts of money into Swiss banks. To do so would provoke the Nazis into action.
That might make Hitler furious, and he would decide, I have to attack those people who seem to be friendly with the Jews.
The Germans made it easy for the Swiss border guards by having a J printed in Jewish passports.
Und man musste ein Foto haben, wo das linke Ohr ist sichtbar war, also wie für die Verbrecherkartei. Und dann musste man Fingerabdrücke geben. Und es ist natürlich schon sehr diskriminierend. Und für viele hat das bedeutet, dass sie dann einfach zurückgewiesen worden sind. Man hat sie gerade erkannt. Und das war das Todesurteil.
Many Jews who reached the Swiss border were sent back to face certain death in the camps. And many Jews who were stopped at the border committed suicide rather than be sent back. Hitler needed Switzerland to take his gold and launder it into hard currency, with which he could buy the weapons to continue to prosecute the war. Many of these armaments were manufactured in Swiss factories, so the Swiss raked in even more money in a second level of transaction, that is, by selling vast amounts of ammunition and other vital war material to Germany. Because of Switzerland's supposed neutrality, its arms factories could not be bombed by the Allies, even though their weapons were destined for Hitler's war against them. While British and American bombers successfully dented the industrial capacity of the Third Reich, in Switzerland, the unmolested factories continued to churn out weapons.
There's a document which we've read, which I find curious, sent by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the Secretary of State in 1940, I believe it was 43, in the spring of 43. And it said that our bombing of Germany was rather ineffective because the Swiss kept shipping in the stuff to replace it.
To exacerbate the situation, the Swiss Air Force actually shot down Allied bombers that strayed into its airspace. It remains one of the most glaring acts of hypocrisy of the whole war. But even worse, recent evidence confirms that Switzerland allowed German trains carrying enslaved laborers to pass through its neutral territory. A Swiss railwayman, Otto Frey, remembers being ordered to keep this fact a secret.
Ab und zu hat man das Hilferuf gehört, aber das ist also minim gesehen. Die sind natürlich auch vom Ausgangsbahnhof Gasso sind die vorgemeldet worden und man hat dann die mit einer gewissen Sorgfalt müssen behandeln, dass sie schlanker weg wieder zu der Schweiz ausgekommen sind.
Even trains destined for the death camps made their way through Swiss stations. There's evidence that in late 1943 in Zurich, a train carrying Italian Jews was halted. One woman remembers a chilling night when she was asked to take soup to the station.
There was a Red Cross official, the lady, who told us the trains would come in at night, that we were supposed to bring flashlights, that we would be in teams of 4. Very slowly, these cars came and stopped, and a man came out from our station, and one of the recollections I had is, although it was very dark, when this car opened, the man or the face who peeked out was very white. It was very tense. And I also remember I thought, what would happen if all of a sudden all these people pushed this man aside and came tumbling out of the car? And I was worried. In a way, I wished they would be free, but in a way, I didn't want them to come out. We knew that they were going to Germany. We knew they were Jews. We knew about the concentration camps.
Switzerland was clearly not innocent, and certainly complicit in some of the most heinous crimes of the Nazi regime. But even as the war turned against Hitler, the Swiss continued to prosper. As German armies retreated, many Nazis, fearing Allied retribution, deposited their ill-gotten gains into Swiss banks. In a nightmare development, this wealth was earmarked to create one of Nazism's most perverse schemes, the infrastructure of the Fourth Reich. By the autumn of 1943, Hitler's dream of a Nazi empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals began to evaporate. The army had got bogged down in the mud and ice of Russia. Thousands of casualties were strewn across the landscape, from Stalingrad to Kursk. Senior Nazi bureaucrats realized their illicit wealth was no longer safe in the Third Reich. The steady flow of looted gold into secret bank accounts in Switzerland grew into a flood. Stolen art treasures were auctioned in Swiss art galleries, and the proceeds used to prepare escape routes for senior Nazis to evade the encroaching Allied forces. But in 1944, British and American intelligence agents became aware of these transactions. They responded by initiating Operation Safe Haven. Its mission was to locate, track and retrieve Nazi assets that were being moved into neutral countries. The revelations from their covert investigation were appalling. Under cover of Swiss secrecy laws, the Nazis appeared to have shipped over $6 billion in assets to Switzerland between 1938 and 1945. In today's values, that represents at least $60 billion. A lot of this money was to be used to help high-ranking Nazis escape from Allied justice. An American intelligence report identified a massive sum held by Hitler's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop. The senior Nazi politician used the German embassy in Geneva to launder a fortune in gold to banks in Lugano and Lucerne, a fortune that remained in secret accounts long after the war was over. Ribbentrop may also have helped transfer funds for German industrialists who were planning to rebuild their business empires after the war was over. But the deceit did Ribbentrop no good. He was tried at Nuremberg in 1945 and found guilty of war crimes. 11 months later, he was hanged. In Holland, another escape fund belonging to German industrialists was located by American intelligence agents. But buried within the safe haven files is an even more disturbing revelation. Evidence that some German industrialists were preparing to resurrect a new Reich after the war. They worked with a group of top SS officers. Using neutral countries, they planned to accumulate wealth and missile technology that could be channeled to Nazis working underground in post-war Germany. The plan was never implemented, but neither has the money ever been recovered. Yet another safe haven document contains the names, addresses and telephone numbers of over 30 Swiss lawyers who, the agents believed, were hiding German assets, including gold and looted art treasures. In the final year of the war, Allied bombing pounded the heart of Berlin into rubble. The Reichsbank and its branches suffered severe damage, and the Nazis decided to disperse their holdings to hiding places scattered around the country. The wealth was sent south by truck and train to Bavaria. There it was hidden in deep caves in the Alps. Most of it was recovered by the Allies at the end of the war, but $20 million worth of it has never been found. In 1984, Ian Sayer, author of Nazi Gold, went on a search for the missing treasure. He describes what happened next at the lakeside village of Einsiedel.
One dark, very dark evening, German soldiers dressed as German officers took it up, led mules all the way along that mountainside there, right up to the top. And when they got to the top, they buried this gold and the currency into a number of different holes right at the top of the mountain there. And there it stayed until the Americans occupied the area.
When the Americans arrived in Einsiedel in 1945, they heard rumors about this missing treasure. One of the Germans who had buried the gold, Colonel Friedrich Rauch, decided to rebury it in the village of Garmisch.
They buried the currency in that garden of that house just over there. It stayed there for some weeks, and then Colonel Rauch came back again with an American and quite a few troops. And he demanded of the people that were in the house that they should hand over the currency, and he specified a particular sum. He gave them 3 weeks to dig all the money out of the garden, and then 3 weeks later he came back, collected it all up and put it in his jeep and headed off down the hill. The last time it was ever seen was in US military custody, and nobody has ever seen it since.
Joseph Pinzel was one of the Germans involved in hiding this gold and remembers revealing part of the hoard to the Americans.
I'd been gossiping to my friends in the guest house that I knew where the gold was hidden. As a result, 2 Americans probably from their intelligence agency, came to me, and I took them to a place called the Cow Hole up in Einsiedel. A German officer joined us, and we went up the mountain. They took a metal detector. The needle started to move at a place covered by logs. It was a very big hole. One of the Americans went off straight away and came back with 2 lorries which they loaded. It looked like square bricks, like something heavy. Yes, gold. They loaded it onto the lorry, a huge amount.
But when American officials made an inventory of the money, they were disconcerted to find that some $20 million worth of it in gold had disappeared. American and German soldiers may be the culprits. The money has never been recovered. Jewish survivors of the Holocaust are now trying to rebuild their lives and recover the life savings of their dead relatives. What they have found is denial and obstruction. Swiss banks have been involved in one of the most disturbing stories of the aftermath of war. (1945) marked the end of the war in Europe. American soldiers had uncovered some of the stolen treasure in the mountains of southern Germany. In the Kaiserode salt mine, they found gold and cash from the Reichsbank. Wealth stolen by the SS, precious stones, share certificates, and gold teeth from concentration camp victims. They also discovered many stolen cultural treasures, including paintings and sculpture, some of the finest works of the Renaissance and Baroque periods. The amount of recovered gold rose steadily, but it was still just the tip of the iceberg. The reserves of entire countries were still hidden in some Swiss bank accounts. While high-ranking Nazis were still being tried at Nuremberg, the Allies embarked on an investigation into the dealings of Switzerland and its bankers. Assets in both America and Britain were frozen, as Swiss banks were searched for forgotten German accounts. Many senior Nazis were sentenced to death at Nuremberg, but no such penalties could be served on the Swiss bank managers who stored their money. Switzerland was, for many years after 1945, a continuing haven of neutrality on the frontier of the Cold War between the capitalist West and the communist East. While Operation Safe Haven, the investigation into the Nazi trafficking of gold, remained in place, the Allies decided to settle with Swiss bank officials. Britain was more keen than America to reach a quick agreement. The country was desperate to raise Swiss bank loans in order to rebuild the many cities that had been severely damaged. The Allies claimed that Swiss banks held $400 million in German gold. After negotiations in Washington, the US and Britain took $60 million in total, and Switzerland kept the rest. It was a gross underestimate of the amount of wealth that actually flowed into Swiss bank accounts from Nazi Germany. It was a very generous settlement from the Swiss point of view. But it was a settlement that did not include the Swiss bank accounts opened by Jews before the war. And when Holocaust victims and their relatives came to retrieve their families' holdings, some Swiss banks became obstructive. To all appearances, it seemed they didn't want the survivors to have the money that was rightfully theirs. The story of Elizabeth Trilling-Groch was typical. During the war, Elizabeth's mother had hidden her in an attic in the Warsaw Ghetto to avoid her capture. She recalls how her mother tried to buy their way out of the ghetto with money held in a Swiss bank account.
Telling the superintendent that she was going to write him a letter withdrawing 3,000 gold marks. Now, I don't know whether he ever did it, but I know that he denounced her and she was sent to Treblinka.
Elizabeth was rescued by her non-Jewish nanny and cared for by a Polish family. Having survived the war, she went to Switzerland to claim her parents' savings. The bank demanded impossible conditions.
Death certificates, which is sort of so preposterous, and I think so insulting. Surely they knew what was going on.
The banks did know what they were doing. They knew Nazi camps did not provide death certificates for those they had murdered. Even when a Holocaust survivor knew the precise number of the pre-war account, the bank still prevaricated. Stephen Foti, a New Yorker and the son of a Holocaust victim, remembered his father's exact words.
My father told me, listen, I have the account number. You go to the bank and you are going to receive this, whatever you have there. Okay? So I was 100% sure that that's how this works.
His father had anticipated problems, and so he hid the account number in his driving license.
Here are the numbers. Here are 4 numbers.
In one account alone, his father had deposited 18,000 Swiss francs. But still, the Swiss bank denied any knowledge of the account. Even when the banks announced the existence of 775 accounts untouched since the war, they refused to publish a list of the names of the holders of these accounts. The banks claimed these strict privacy laws had first been introduced in the 1930s to protect Jewish deposit accounts from the rapacious attentions of the Nazis. But these same laws were being used to deny Jewish families access to their own accounts. It was time to expose this hypocrisy. The cozy world of Swiss banking was about to be blown apart by the intervention of a group of powerful Americans. The secrecy of the Swiss banks would be unable to protect their darkest secret of the war. 1995 marked the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. But many survivors of the Holocaust, the victims and their relatives, still suffered from injustice. For many years, Swiss banks had managed to resist their claims. They needed help urgently. It finally came from a businessman who was chairman of the World Jewish Council. Having heard many stories of justice denied, Edgar Bronfman decided to fly to Bern and confront the banks.
The entire Jewish world is part of my family. And sure, I lost 6 million members of my family, so to speak, in the Holocaust. And the victims, very much in my mind. And the survivors, very much in my mind.
Israel Singer worked with him.
The people who were fighting in World War II were clearly the evil and the good, and the Swiss decided to be neutral in a struggle between evil and good.
They received an icy welcome in Bern, where they were accused of hatching a plot to bring Swiss banks into disrepute. After lengthy negotiations, the bankers announced they had managed to trace some dormant Jewish bank accounts and offered to pay out $32 million, a fraction of the amount deposited in the 1930s.
This is supposed to be the final stop, and here's the money, and take it and behave yourself. What I realized was this is going to be a tough battle.
The Swiss tried to defuse the growing confrontation by setting up their own investigation. In September 1996, Switzerland's lower house of parliament voted for a sweeping and rigorous survey of its financial dealings with Nazi Germany. In New York, Edgar Bronfman gained access to wartime documents showing that Switzerland had colluded with the Nazis. He was delighted to make these public. He also had another weapon. Senator Alphonse D'Amato was chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. D'Amato had joined the fight to open the bank accounts, and he had the power to shut down branches of the Swiss banks on Wall Street. This put serious pressure on the bankers. At a press conference in January 1997, Senator D'Amato unveiled some of the documents which incriminated the banks.
For the first time since our inquiry began last December, we have documents confirming that the Swiss were actively and directly involved in shipping gold for Nazis. These documents show that the Swiss claim of neutrality in World War II was pure nonsense.
He cited wartime American intelligence about Swiss support for the carrying of Nazi gold out of Germany.
In January 1946, we have a memo directed to William Donovan. He was the head of the OSS at that time, which was a predecessor to the CIA. The document indicates that high-level Swiss uncovered trails of 280 truckloads of German gold bars sent from the Swiss to Spain and Portugal between May of 1943 and February 1944. 280 truckloads of gold.
At the same press conference, Ilan Steinberg of the World Jewish Council made it clear where much of this gold had come from.
The gold in those trucks included the gold of wedding rings, the gold from gold watches, and even, as we now know, its most grisly form, the gold teeth literally ripped from the mouths of the death camp victims.
President Clinton himself was prepared to reveal secret wartime files. In the face of such embarrassing and damaging revelations, the stone wall of the Swiss bank's resistance began to crumble. It came close to collapse when Christoph Meili, a bank security guard from Zurich, arrived in America carrying pre-war bank records. He had managed to rescue the documents from being destroyed, but as a result, he was in fear of his life.
Und es sind zwei, sie hatten die Blätter aufeinander gelegt und gerollt und hatten die unter meinem Hemd hinein und hatten das einmal in meinem Kasten, meinen Umkleidekasten gebracht. Dann bin ich zurück und habe das Buch von 1920.
Some families of Holocaust survivors engaged lawyers and vowed to sue the Swiss banks for $20 billion. In an interim agreement, the Swiss agreed to pay out $10 million to elderly Jews still living in Eastern Europe. They reasoned that those people had suffered under both the Nazis and the communists. The payment was welcomed, but it was still not enough to quell international pressure. Switzerland's foreign minister, Flavio Cotti, began to feel that pressure.
It's also our task in Switzerland to discuss this period of the Second World War, which was a very, very difficult period for our country, and where we certainly also made mistakes.
In December 1997, representatives from 41 nations met in London for the first international conference devoted to finding the Nazis' gold. Delegates from Poland and Austria laid claim to 5 tons of looted gold held in Allied bank vaults for safekeeping during the war. They declared they would hand over any reclaimed money to a fund for Holocaust survivors. Among the delegates was the US Under-Secretary of State, Stuart Eisenstadt.
And therefore, we call on all concerned here in London and those elsewhere to accelerate the pace and complete their great task before we enter the new millennium. The work of the historical commissions underway in so many countries should be completed by then. The funds which have been established and those which will be established should disperse a generous portion of their contributions to Holocaust survivors by the end of this millennium.
But one of the blackest revelations came when Swiss gold coins were tested for their chemical content. They were found to have a very high level of mercury, 10 times the normal content, which indicated the presence of gold used to fill teeth. A forensic dentist, David Whittaker, thinks the gold has come from fillings taken from the mouths of Jews.
You wouldn't expect to find mercury to any great level in refined gold, gold that's used for bullion or gold that's used for making coinage and so on. So if you're finding, or if someone is finding fairly high levels of mercury, then there is a possible route, theoretically speaking, in which it could have got there. And one could set the scenario, for example, of gold fillings in a person's mouth, and also some silver amalgam in the same mouth, or indeed in other mouths close by. There is a possibility, I think, of some of that mercury amalgamating, chemically fusing, as it were, to the gold, and therefore becoming part of the bullion.
Threatened with boycotts of and sanctions against branches of Swiss banks in the United States and elsewhere, the Swiss bankers finally agreed to a hugely improved arrangement of $1.25 billion to be paid out over 3 years. On the 18th of August 1998, the news was announced by Senator D'Amato.
I think it brings closure to this matter, and it will bring a measure of justice and help to people who need it, and I'm tremendously pleased.
In the same year, Nazi gold hunter Ian Sayer, with his co-author Douglas Botting, published a new edition of his book. They claim there was a cover-up over American and German theft of Nazi gold in 1945. Sayer calculates the worth of the missing gold in today's values at $4 billion. Some of it, he believes, was used to fund covert operations by the OSS, the antecedent of the CIA.
I have good reason to believe that Nazi gold was being used by American covert operations to obviously to counter the communist threat.
Stung by this criticism, the American State Department set up a commission of historians to examine the controversy. In 2001, the first major payments from the Swiss banks were released. The New York-based group administering the billion-dollar fund sent payments to 35,000 Holocaust survivors in 36 countries. Some of them were given to people used as slave labor by the Nazis. But for many of the people who received the money, it revived bitter memories of wartime anguish, as a Holocaust survivor, Barbara Traub, recalls.
It took a long time, years and years, for the Swiss to even admit that there were those accounts, dormant accounts. But I think that it's better later than never. But there is bitterness in my heart.
After decades of deception, the Swiss banks have finally settled their account with the families of surviving Holocaust victims. But the painstaking investigation has revealed something that defies explanation. How Switzerland, a supposedly neutral country, could make such a Faustian pact with the Nazi devil and be happy to profit from it. Today, it remains one of the bleakest enigmas of the Second World War.